13 civil society groups have rejected the introduction of a consensus as a mode for the nomination of candidates seeking election into public offices in the Electoral Act Amendment Bill. The groups faulted the action of the Senate in a statement jointly signed by them on Wednesday, hours after the lawmakers modified the proposed amendments to the Electoral Act, while the members of the Senate and the House of Representatives agreed to include the indirect option as another mode of conducting primaries. Lawmakers in the upper chamber went on to add consensus as a third option. The groups asked the Senate to adopt the position of the House of Representatives, which recognizes direct and indirect primaries as a procedure for nomination of candidates in line with the popular will of the people. Well, to further shed light on the issue, I'm joined now by a representative from Yaga Africa, one of the 13 CSOs that rejected the consensus mode of adoption by the Senate. Now, joining me to discuss this further is Cynthia Umabalu, Director of Programs at Yaga Africa. Thank you very much for joining us on News Now. Now, for clarity's sake, can you explain the difference between the indirect primaries and the consensus mode of primaries?
Yeah, so for the indirect primaries, what the law requires is the parties, through their, as provided in their constitution and in the guidelines, elect their candidates through a delegate system. So for indirect primaries, different parties, for instance, have either statutory delegates or delegates elected via a convention, and these delegates would be the voters who would elect the candidates from a list of aspirants in the primary process. So at least for indirect primaries, there's a sense of competition. It means that as long as individuals qualify to contest in the party for a particular office, then they can compete at the primary levels and a delegate to choose them. Now, for the direct primaries, what is required is that all members, all registered members of the parties would elect their candidates from a list of aspirants. However, for consensus, the conversation about consensus, which is one of the reasons why we as CSO partners do not believe is democratic, is the fact that consensus, the idea of consensus is that an individual is agreed by a group of people in a party as the candidates for the party. So what it does is there is no form of election whatsoever. There is no form of competition, and whatever the individuals in the party decide would be what would determine who the candidate is. And I know there were conversations around, oh, we've had a sense of consensus before, and in times without number, we have stated that the consensus mode is not an acceptable mode of primaries because, one, it's against democratic principles. Secondly, it limits the opportunities of individuals and parties to contest at the primary level. And third, it forces candidates on parties and even on voters, thereby limiting the choice of voters in an elections. Now, it is important we clearly state the distinction between consensus party candidates and when there is only a single aspirant. Now, in the current Electoral Act, there is a provision for where, for instance, there is only one individual who is the aspirant, no other aspirant has indicated interest, and there is a process that requires some level of voting at different levels for that singular aspirant. Now, that is different from a consensus candidate. Introducing consensus in this bill by the Senate, the implication of this introduction of consensus is that individuals who want to aspire may be limited from aspiring for office. You've heard instances where people are denied the right to even purchase candidate nomination forms to get their tickets to contest in a primaries, and that negates the principles of democracy and is antithetical to democratic principles. In every system where you have democracy practice, in developed democracy and even developing democracies, primary elections are very fundamental. That in fact, there is a lot of attention to primary elections. But I think our lawmakers, actually in the Senate, are yet to understand the importance of a primary elections. That from that level, the level of competition must be in such a way that aspirants who qualify have the freedom to contest in respective parties. But by the time you introduce consensus, you limit the opportunities of aspirants who want to contest at that level. You also force candidates on parties, because at the end, what you would have is a select few in a party determining who the candidates would be. And at the end of the day, voters will be subjected to that choice that has been determined by a select few in the party. And we believe, as TSO partners, we also believe as individuals who are working to build a democratic society, that for this electoral amendment bill, what is important, the president said, review the section, the clause 84 on mode of primaries. We agree that yes, you should review that, and the House has gone ahead to review to introduce indirect primaries. Let us limit this conversation to direct or indirect primaries as the acceptable mode of primaries. And we call on the National Assembly, as they constitute the Harmonization Committee, to adopt the version by the House. This is the desires of the citizens. This is good for our democracy. We do not want a system that is introduced to limit choice, limit freedom, rather than expand freedom and expand the equal opportunity of every individual to contest at party primary level in respective political parties.
Cynthia Umba Maluth, Director of Programs at Siaga Africa, thank you very much for your contributions.